All right, well, we're back again with Evan, and say your name here.
Of
No.
Doom, Steve.
Okay, so we've got Doom Steve, and we've got me.
That's right.
And I am about to drop this bombshell of an amazing article on you.
There's no such thing as bombshells.
Fake news.
Stay-at-home orders cut noise exposure. Fuck that. That's retarded.
Isn't it?
Like, who? Of course they do.
You don't say. So
There's a huge issue that I have. So psychology does this stuff, right? Where they basically turn around and take like no shit Sherlock studies, and they go and they investigate something, and they publish a finding that doesn't mean anything because literally, if you thought more than 3 seconds on something, while drunk, you would still come to that same conclusion. The fact that environmental noise dropped, when we all of a
dropped
sudden
by
locked
nearly
down
half,
the entire.
I'll have you know,
Oh
during the
my
early
God.
months.
That's just nuts.
For a short
That's nuts.
time, the sky wasn't falling.
You know what really irritates? So I actually, like I said, I've mentioned many times I live in New York,
Condolences.
and you drive down to the city. I had to do it a few weeks ago to go pick up my car.
Oh my God,
It
I'm
is
so sorry.
amazing. Yeah, it really is. I was too. It is amazing what their environment is like down there because here, like, I can go walk outside and I can go into my backyard. And if it's 5 or 6, I might hear the occasional truck going up on the main route back behind my house, right? But beyond that, it's miles and miles of birds and bats and wilderness. And my air is clean and it's not a big deal. But you go to the city, right? And I think we were probably about 20 miles north of the city. We could see it. It was on the horizon, right? And it's still a cloud of smog.
Yeah, I'm sure it's got kind of a miasma of city.
It does. It's really gross. So I when you get all these folks on the left who live in these mega cities sitting there and talking about their environmental concerns, I actually understand and empathize with them because when you only have a few square blocks holding a few million people, your environment is kind of terrible. And I've lived in smaller cities. I lived in Taunton, Mass, and some of those other things. And the amount of noise pollution is just excessive. But I see things like this, and I would be willing to bet your particulates dropped, your overall emissions dropped, almost everything dropped during this period of time where everybody was staying inside. They didn't have to travel from point A to point B. They weren't going outside. There wasn't a whole bunch of, screaming women at frat parties kind of thing, right? The overall everything kind of dropped. But it doesn't mean anything. Who cares? Right?
Yeah, it's basically all useless numbers. It's like,
it is.
When it doesn't rain, the ground is dry.
That's true. It also, like, just because the noise sound levels dropped, right? Who cares, right? What does that mean? Is that something that we should strive for? Is it a reduction in noise?
Well,
I would rather have noise and money.
Reduction in terms of exposure, and it could have a great effect on people's overall health outcomes over time.
Oh,
according to Rick Neitzel, who is an associate professor of something that matters very much.
I'm sure it could. I mean, don't get me wrong, right? So as an individual who happens to be somewhat sensitive to sights and smells and sounds, right? We talked a little bit before the show started about how I have a messy house. I am pretty convinced at this point that that's because of my response to cleaning products is like I have very high chemical sensitivity. I know it's kind of ironic as a chemical engineer, but as an individual who's really sensitive to their environment, being out of a city is a huge relief. The air doesn't smell gross. There isn't a lot of sound. But for the people who want to live in cities, is really a reduction in traffic something that they're going to smile at? Because if you're super happy because the noise levels dropped, guess what? don't live in a fucking city.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. You just learned something really new about yourself.
Right? Like, what's the point?
Like, oh, it's so nice when I don't see people all around me, and it's a little bit more quiet. There's a thing that's called. It's called not living in the city.
Go to the suburbs. Go to rural areas.
Yeah, if you're,
you'd be surprised.
There are suburbs not far from any major city. I promise you. And depending on which major city you're in, they're probably not on fire. So look into that.
I mean, even like going to New York City, the surrounding area, you go 45 minutes north of the city by car, and it's farmland. So, I see people who, it was not too long ago, I saw somebody post something about how they couldn't afford to live in, like Irving, California, which, by the way, is like Laguna Beach. Right, that's the area they're complaining about it being too expensive to live in.
Oh,
right?
So yeah, less
if
than
you go
LA, but not something that normal humans ever want to actually do. Right.
Right. Exactly. If you go just a little bit outside of that, your property values drop so precipitously that if you buy into that area or you're renting in that area, it costs you like nothing to live there. You don't have these high noise levels. You don't have these high smell levels. And not everything smells like hobo piss as you're walking down the street. And I think that's a wonderful experience.
I mean, really?
I could not. In fact, my wife gets really mad because her hometown was the city of Taunton. And I rip on it all day long. Because I don't like the smell of homeless people. I don't particularly like hearing gunshots throughout the night.
I hate to inform
and I'm
you,
not a
that
big
actually
fan.
Makes you a bigot and possibly a racist.
I'm okay with that. I will accept all of those criticisms. I will hang out with my Asian friends and my black friends and be called a bigot.
Fair enough.
If I don't have to listen to sirens. I don't have anybody knocking at my door at night. Yeah, okay, so there's a huge reduction in noise sounds. Who gives a shit? That's expected.
Yeah,
you locked people in their homes.
It's really something else. I had to get your raw reaction to this because it's such a bullshit non-study. Like,
did you though? Did you really?
Oh, absolutely. This was so good. I had just went into it almost blind myself because it's just, you're astounded at times.
Well, it's kind of like psych studies, right? I remember this one came out, and it found that people get worse at math problems as they get drunk, and you're like, yes, yes, they do.
Peer-reviewed, no less, I'm sure.
So I see this stuff. This stuff when I was dealing with psych studies, a lot of these things are in the same category, where it's kind of obvious, but. It's just trash. We should just ignore it because A, it doesn't tell us that this is a goal, and B, if this is a goal, then maybe mega cities are not the environment that human beings should be living in. And if that happens, maybe the whole entire craziness associated with soy boys goes away.
That'll take a minute, but I'll take any inroads we can get. We're well and deeply infused with far too much soy, and we could definitely use whatever the word for getting rid of a bunch of soy is. Maybe we need to come up with
Soylent Green?
I heard something about that from someone once. Maybe that it was really healthy. Yeah, it was really healthy. Yeah, definitely.
I just want to make sure you know what Soylent Green is, right?
It's a healthy food stuff. So that's good.
It is a healthy food stuff
for peoples of all ages and persuasions.
Well, I think it's not for all ages.
Well, it is. Just up to the expiration date.
You know what? All of this means that I have to go cut up some steak. I have successfully acquired a steak that I smoked for several hours last night, and I'm going to have to cut it up just to decrease the amount of soilentness that I've had to listen to.
Oh, that's reasonable.
So.
Yeah. Now, you had linked...
Let's
you were
move
wanting
on.
to talk about fracking. So
I did.
Bust it out on us. What you got?
Nothing good. So I was actually sitting in the office this week, and they were talking a little bit about the VP debates, and they mentioned how the Republicans were lying all the time, and I'm like, what did they lie about? And they said, well, they lied about fracking. I'm like, well, what did they lie about with fracking? They said, well, they said that there's no harms. I'm like, there aren't any harms, right? What ends up happening, and this is one of the things, the reason I want to talk about this in terms of fracking, is this translates into a larger political discussion about risk. And I know we try to stay away from politics here, but it actually really irritates me.
Not a way away, just, you know.
But yeah, I know. I mean, like, it all kinds of feeds into itself, but...
Oh, it does. Well, it's all in Ouroboros anyway.
Right. The stuff that irritates me about politics, and actually the reason that I'm no longer, like, I used to vote Democrat, I used to vote Libertarian, the reason I don't is because politics is outright nuts. Now, when we talk about risk, more specifically when we're talking about political decisions associated with risk, the presumption is, and this is the lie, right? The presumption is that whatever it is that's being proposed or being discussed matters. That's one component of every political discussion, right? Because if you turned around and you said, I want to murder all of the bears, right? And I turned around and said, why? And you said, because they shit in the woods. The presumption is bear shit in the woods is a problem. That is the inherent assumption.
Okay.
And when we start talking about half a dozen different fields, whether it be nuclear, whether it be fracking, whether it be, driving cars or whatever else it is, this is where the lie is. And this irritates me because there's we talked a little bit about it, I think, a week or two ago when Craig was on. We mentioned that there's always that nugget of truth, right, in all of these left-wing policies. But at the same time, while there is some sort of element of truth to whatever's being said by the political left, there is an outright, complete, and total lie. And I think fracking is one of the best cases of this, right? Because, again, the presumption for why we're discussing on a political level fracking is that whatever decisions we make will have a practical impact. Would you agree with that?
Well, one would presume.
Right? So when you start talking about fracking, what is the first thing that people, comment on as a reason why we should ban fracking?
In my experience, it's been poisoned water.
Oh. Okay.
Leached out whatever's from the fracking, the hydraulic fluid or whatever.
So in the case of the discussion that I had at work, they led with earthquakes. I'll get to the poison water.
I've heard that one. I have heard that one. That is like one of the other big ones, but you did ask. That is honestly the argument I've heard the most of.
I'm okay with that. I'll tackle that one second.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because the earthquake thing is what's irritating the crap out of me.
But yeah, no, the earthquake thing is, it's the more bombastic headline too, anyway.
And based on your region of the country, actually the order of operations there makes sense, right? Because I know we'll talk a little bit about poisoned water. We will. I'll dive into that. I promise you, because that's totally worth talking about, and it does actually more closely affect your region of the country than it does anyone else. And that's why what I have found when I was in New Hampshire and when I'm in Massachusetts and when I was in New York, the common thread was earthquakes. Now, the issue with discussing earthquakes is that on a technical level, there is some truth to arguing that fracking causes earthquakes. It's also a blatant lie, right? So I think the earliest evidence that we had back in 2009 through 2011, in that time frame, there was a significant amount of earthquakes that were noticed in Ohio and Oklahoma and all of that stuff, and they were presuming that these were due to fracking, right? And that's what the argument was. And that's not entirely true. What it really has to do is wastewater disposal. And this is not just for fracking. This is for nearly all of the oil and gas industry. So the oil and gas industry, are you familiar with oil and gas?
To a degree. I'll let you know if you lose me.
Okay. So we have multiple stages of recovery for oil, right? So if we drill an oil well, right, you get that big spurt of hydrocarbons coming up. Everybody can think of those. What's that?
You get your raw crude.
Right, you get your raw crude, it spurts up, you just punctured through the rock, and it's this big pressure overload, and everybody's happy because they're making a ton of money, but there's all that, we all know those movies where there's this desperation to kind of, seal the pipe and get everything all in. That's your primary recovery. And your primary recovery is to literally pump out a crude bed, which is going to be some mixture of mud plus the oil plus all the other stuff. And you're going to drain that as much as you can, right? But if I was to draw 100% pure vacuum, right, there is zero atmosphere between where that crude bed is and where our atmosphere is. There's only so much that I can suck up. There's only as we go deeper and deeper into the rock layers to retrieve this stuff, because we've already pretty much picked the low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
As we go deeper and deeper into these beds, there's a limitation on how much we can just straight up pump out. And that pumping out phase is I believe that's considered your primary recovery phase, where you're just pumping out the oil because there's excess pressure from the entire weight of the ocean or the rocks or whatever is on top of this oil that actually creates pressure in that zone, and so it actually comes up, which is what causes, that's what caused the leak in Deep Horizon and whatnot. The secondary phase is where we start injecting things into these wells, right? So we have a pipe down there. It's got some oil, but we can only suck up. Like if I was to have pure vacuum on water, I could only suck up something like 32 feet of water, just about thereabouts. And if I had a water column that's any greater than 32 feet, I think oil we can get a little bit more than that. But if I had a water column that was any greater than 32 feet, that's the maximum I could do if it was pure vacuum. So what we can do to retrieve that next tier of oil is we can do what's known as the secondary retrieval phase. Right, and that's where we start injecting things like steam, or we start injecting water, and we pressurize the well, which forces stuff up into the pipe that we can retrieve. Right, so that's the secondary retrieval phase. And that has wastewater components associated with it. There's tertiary retrieval, which I think is actually where normally we're starting to – secondary retrieval is like pressurized saline. Tertiary retrieval is more like pressurized CO2, because you kind of want to start draining the actual bed itself. It's the most complicated and expensive method of operation in the oil and gas field. But you start talking about the small O&G companies, that's where a lot of them go. They'll go after these fields that have already been pumped dry from primary recovery. They've either entered secondary recovery or they're past secondary recovery, and they're going in for tertiary recovery, hoping to gather the stuff up that's just been too difficult to get at it through the easy methods, right? Are you following me so far?
Yeah, I got
right? You. So this whole process, outside of primary recovery, has a shitload, a metric shitload of wastewater production, right? This is going to be stuff that we are injecting into these wells, and we are recovering it afterwards. And what do you do with it, right? You have this hydrocarbon-laden mess, and it costs
probably a really Probably a really diluted slurry of all sorts of shit, too.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. Now, are there ways that we could process it? Sure. But you know, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to pump it right back down into the ground, right? To put it into these wells that we have pumped to the point where we're no longer getting anything out of. So we might as well put our wastewater there, right? That makes sense. Well,
at the very least, from a logistics point of view.
Right. Yeah. So I've got a field of 12 wells. I've used a ton of wastewater. I'm going to go to the well that I know is empty, that I can't get anything out of, and I'll pump it down there. Or I'll drill a new well, because that only costs so much. And if I was to sit there and start building an entire wastewater treatment facility just for my well injection water, that would be very expensive. So it's cheaper for me to drill a deep hole than it is for me to treat my water, right? That the injection of wastewater into deep water wells is what has caused earthquakes, right? Some of that
elaborate on that a bit, if you would.
So what you again, this is the earthquakes thing associated with, so I'm going to try to tie it back. Earthquakes associated with fracking. It is not due to the fracking process itself. It is due to the, hold on, sorry, I got to chase the husky out.
Understood.
Out you go, husky.
Understood.
He wants to comment on the steak that I previously mentioned I pulled out. It is sitting here on my desk.
Lots of thoughts on that.
He has quite the extensive. He could write an essay if he had the ability on how much he wants that steak.
I believe it.
Out.
I believe it.
Out you go. All right. So, you wanted me to elaborate on wastewater, right?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to tie this back to the fracking and the earthquakes. So, what ends up happening is we start injecting this wastewater into these wells, right? We either drill a deep hole on their own, or we put it into the wells. Either way, we are putting a substance that is, water's pretty good at dissolving stuff and taking stuff out, so we're kind of futzing up with the structure underneath the subsurface of the earth, right? Some components are going to dissolve that wouldn't have dissolved otherwise. Some components are going to have this, we're doing this high pressure injection column of water that's all wastewater. We're pumping it really deep into the earth, and that's going to cause, shifts in the actual rock strata there, right? The end result is some of that collapses. And when it collapses, it produces an earthquake, right? But we need to talk about earthquakes, because this has its own frame of reference.
Okay, I may have lost something there. So what exactly is the cause of the earthquake? Like an overpressure or an...
It's a variety of different processes. For the most part, I think the last time I looked into it extensively, it had to do with futzing around with being right on a fault line. But ultimately, if you change the structure underneath the surface of the rock, right? So it had oil there. We've pumped out the oil. The rock's still there. Now we're sitting there and we're injecting high pressure water into this rock underneath the earth. It's going to distort that structure a little bit, and the end result is shifting.
Okay,
right?
That makes
so
sense.
I
got you.
Right. So we're going to be breaking it up a little bit. We're going to have kind of semi-void space. It's going to shift a little bit here and there. And ultimately, when rock shifts, especially deep down in the core,
earthquake.
That is the nature of an earthquake, right? And this happens because we have to dispose of a shitload of wastewater in comparison to everything else that we're doing, right? That will produce a small earthquake. Now, I want to emphasize the small earthquake, because this matters, right? So an earthquake, when people think of an earthquake, they think of Escape from LA and the major fault line out there, and it's the big one, and toppled buildings and ruptured roads and pipelines. The stuff that we're talking
about... An earthquake can be as small as, just the minorest of tremors.
It really can. And that's where the big lie comes in. Because ultimately, when we start talking about a Category 1 earthquake, we as human beings are literally incapable of detecting it.
Yeah,
right?
That's in the area of actually needing instruments to detect, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
And I mean, even that's one where some animals don't even react to those.
That would also be correct.
That's where, just your really sensitive animals begin to have reactions, and even then, it's just that they're more panicky.
Right, exactly. And you start talking about your Category 2s, right? That's actually not much different than a Category 1, right? So you might notice something. The most sensitive of individuals in a quiet environment might hear something. But you won't experience the building shaking. You won't experience, your shaking and shifting back and forth. None of that happens in a Category 2. A Category 3, which I've actually been in, right? So if you actually go back to New Hampshire in, I think it was 2010, there was actually a Category 3.1 earthquake about 20 to 30 miles away from where I was situated. I experienced that, right?
Right.
The 2 other people living in the house, the dog, the 2 cats, and the 2 chinchillas did not notice the earthquake. I happened to notice it, and everybody thought I was fucking nuts.
Huh.
But that was a Category 3 earthquake. Right, and it is the quickest, it's basically just a shock, right? So you hear a rumble, it would be the equivalent. So in my case, we were on a lake in the middle of nowhere with a road that doesn't have any access outside of anybody who lives on this lake. And it's almost like having an 18-wheeler go by, right? If you've ever experienced that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, actually, I live just far enough from some train tracks that I know what a minor earthquake actually feels like. Because you can only just feel it if you really pay attention. And it's just the slightest sway. It's one of those, you've got to be laying in bed to go to sleep at night and your mind's really clear of things. And you've got to be on it or almost out of it to really notice kind of things. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
It really is. It's a quick rumble. You might hear a noise, you might not, and it feels like a little bit of a vibration under your feet, and it's done. Right? Your dog might sit there and roll over if he happens to be relaxed. If he's a high-anxiety dog, you probably noticed it. The cats will probably not wake up, and most people won't notice it. Now, you start talking about Category 4.
This is when you start to get into the things that people would associate with a Richter scale.
Kind of. It's still at the lower end of what people would notice, right? It's where you'd hear your plates clatter a little bit, right? The largest recorded United States earthquake associated with the injection of wells is on that level. In one time, at one location, there were some plates that clattered. And most people were aware of something that happened. It's still not buildings swaying. It's still not everybody sitting there and freaking out. We aren't talking about cracks in the road. There's no damage to infrastructure. There's no issue with that. In fact, you can get up to I think it's Category 7 before you start hitting issues with infrastructure. That Category 7 is where we should give a shit. Anything Category 5 and below, we really probably shouldn't. So when people start talking about fracking and start saying, hey, the reason that we should ban fracking is because it causes earthquakes, that's a lie.
Oh, fair enough.
And that irritates me.
That's
right?
That's a really solid breakdown. So
that
really goes into some good depth on why it's kind of a non-issue. I mean, it's not to say that it's not real. It's just very overblown, not unlike some of the other alarmist science that we deal with out here. And
and that's kind of the problem is that a lot of people, when the scientists come out and say, hey, guess what? That earthquake occurred due to blah, 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 right? Or this effect we've observed. we're completely ignoring the fact that the scientists are measuring this on instruments which are designed to detect nuclear blasts underground in foreign national countries across the globe, right? We can read when this occurred and what the megatonnage is. This is actually all part of our R&D to understand the nuclear capabilities of foreign nations. And we have this in our seismometers, and that's what they're measuring the earthquakes with. Right? It's not to say that it doesn't exist, but the lie is that it matters. Right? And that irritates the crap out of me, because you're like, well, no, you can simultaneously argue that fracking doesn't cause earthquakes, because it doesn't. It's wastewater injection wells, right? And you can argue that it does because it's a byproduct of a process that fracking ties into. But none of that matters because the earthquake that is produced from this effect is so small and so insignificant that most people wouldn't notice it happened. And that irritates me.
Well, that's kind of one of the big complaints about a lot of science now. You have a scientific consensus more than you have good science.
Well, it comes down to so if you
that's entirely a buzzword, obviously, in the context I'm using it here. I'm not to say that there is an actual consensus of noteworthy scientists. Just there's, buzzword X here that means you should listen to what we have to say.
Right. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, if you go through your basic statistics course, they train you in a couple different things. And one of the things is there's things that are statistically significant, as in we can detect them using the instrumentation that we have, and then there's practical significance. And the example that I tend to give for this when I'm trying to explain it to people is, if you turned around and you measured your oven, right? Most ovens occupy a standard space in your kitchen design. It's actually kind of weird. Most of your
American
kitchen
kitchens
equipment
are pretty modular, honestly.
Right,
I mean,
they
as
really
far
are.
as like the major appliances, the biggest lack of modularity is refrigerators. Like everything else is pretty much, it comes in 3 sizes.
Yep. And when you start talking about this, it would be like somebody turning around and going in and saying, hey, this oven here tells you that it's, X number of cubic feet of oven space. But in reality, compared to this one that is X number of cubic feet, there's a micron of difference. We have the ability, if we really wanted to, of measuring a micron difference between oven sizes.
Yeah, and in this example, we wouldn't be talking about like going from your standard 4-burner oven down to like one of the 2-burner efficiency apartment deals. We're talking about
exactly,
one that happens to be the black one as opposed to the gray one.
Kind of like we would basically be turning around and making
to a Whirlpool, say.
Right. Yes, that would be more accurate. The oven still fits in the same cubby. It still provides the same function. It still has the same capabilities. Everything is perfectly the same, except you as a scientist are capable of measuring a 1 micron difference in the length and the width of an oven. Is it great that you can do that? Yes. Does it fucking matter? No.
Yeah.
Should we turn around and have a Consumer Reports like, SEC investigation because of it? Absolutely not. Should we start fining the companies because there's a minor difference of a micron? No. And this is the same thing with fracking, right?
So kind of a complete issue of splitting hairs then, really.
It really is. And that's
to generalize, I should say, but that really is what it is. I mean, if I'm to understand this correctly, we're in kind of a situation where they're putting the cart before the horse with this.
I don't know if I would put it as putting
that's not a good analogy there at all. I mean, they kind of are, because you got to save the world and you got to save a life, even if it costs whatever. But you're not really saving the world and you're not really saving a life. We're not looking at sinkholes. We're looking at maybe somebody has a mild stumble. Like, and that's about it.
I wouldn't even go as far as a mild stumble, right?
Well, there you go. I mean, this is me talking as the layman. The science man says not even a mild stumble. So there you go.
When you start looking at it, the majority of earthquakes are magnitude 3 or less. Yes, they are earthquakes, but I would call them like tremors or something like that. You're not getting knocked around. There's no damage to your infrastructure. It's not an issue in any way, shape, or form.
It's about the same as, like you were saying, a semi driving past.
Right. So would it be fair for me to turn around and say that there is no earthquakes associated with this thing? Yeah, that's actually fair, because from a practical, realistic standpoint, there really isn't. Is that to say that from a scientific standpoint we can't find something?
Oh yeah, no, it's not accurate in the most technical sense, but
right.
It's not really relevant either.
It is a bigger lie to make the argument that we should ban it because of earthquake generation than to say that we should not ban it because there's no earthquake generation. The people who are arguing there's no earthquake generation and that we shouldn't ban it are closer to the truth than the people who are arguing we should ban it, even though there's a technicality they're sort of right on.
Fair enough.
Right?
I've got something great to segue into, but I really would actually like to address the other side of this one, which is poison well waters.
Poisoned well waters.
And reservoirs, aquifers, et cetera, et cetera.
So basically, this is another one of those things where there's kind of the hidden lie, right?
Sure.
I think it was 2016, the EPA released a report. It could be 2016 or 2018. I'm pretty sure it's 2016. The EPA released a report which found that it is theoretically possible through fracking methods to contaminate well water. In that same report, they also stated it hasn't happened, with the exception of a handful of wells that were drilled in Pennsylvania, which is not terribly far from you, which is probably why you're hearing the most about it, which were drilled something like 20 to 40 years ago using really shoddy methodology, and they are not modern fracking wells, right?
And I've found that. Actually, I'll put a link to it in the show. Actually, I'll put a link to it here just in case you want it, but I'll put a link to it in the Showlinks as well for anybody that wants to follow up on that.
You should be able to find the EPA study.
That's exactly what I got. I'll get the actual one that doesn't have the Google tag on it because, obviously, because
so if you dive into the EPA report, what the EPA report says is it says there is no evidence that fracking has caused problems, with the exception of, I think it actually, literally, they can count them to 12 wells. And it's in Pennsylvania, and they're like 20 to 40-year-old wells, right? Beyond that, it hasn't occurred. But the EPA report also mentioned that it is theoretically possible, assuming that a series of conditions are met, for contamination of drinking water. So it's not impossible that the fracking process could contaminate drinking water. There's just no evidence that it has, right?
Sure.
And that's essentially what they argued. So when you start hearing people argue, well, what about the contamination of well and drinking water? Well, there really isn't any evidence of it. So what they'll pull up is this a handful of very left-wing documentaries which argue that it has contaminated this, and they'll do things that are very wonderful experiments of people who are lighting their faucets on fire.
Oh yeah,
but it turns out, yeah, it is.
That is an iconic image.
It is an iconic image.
Like it's something out of a movie. So yeah, you're gonna be like, oh my god, I can't believe that's real.
But guess what?
Well,
it's not true. It has nothing to do with fracking. Those well waters are a real thing.
Oh yeah, no, that's going to be gas in your water, right?
That is. So what ends up happening when you start talking about fracking is a really interesting process. So when we start talking about fracking, what are they doing? They're going after the shale, which is a very highly porous rock. It tends to be below bedrock, but for the shale that happens to be above the bedrock, it's not particularly useful to go after because it's already leached out its methane and propane and butane, right? Its low chain hydrocarbons have already leached out because it's not sealed. So when we go after fracking stuff, we fracture the shale in the stuff that's kind of under bedrock, essentially stuff that's below the water table. That's why we don't have contamination issues associated with fracking, because we wouldn't frack in areas where the shale that we want to get at is in or has direct contact with the water table, because it would have already bled off the...
Well, yeah, it really wouldn't be there anymore.
Or but there are those areas.
Wouldn't be very usable because it would just be... It'd be kind of like the sludge at the bottom of one of these, oil wells.
Right.
I mean, not the best analogy, but for purposes
of understanding.
No, I mean,
you're actually pretty accurate there, right? At the end of the day, it would be this low yield, maybe we can do it, maybe we can't thing, and it would already have been damaged through water kind of infiltration, because it's not like we're coming at this for the Earth was created 7 days ago and we're coming at it, right? These processes are millions or billions of years old. They've been going on for a long time. If your water is in contact with a shale, it's going to transport the hydrocarbons away. So how do we get this gas and drinking water? Wouldn't that possibly be evidence of fracking contamination? Well, in the cases that they use, they happen to be hundreds of miles away from fracking wells. Why is it they're using this case? Because there are wells that are directly on top of shale deposits, and they have high levels of methane. In fact, there was actually, I could probably provide emails and whatnot, but I was actually contracted by a company. They were going to pay me, and then it turns out that they didn't have the money. This was like circa 2008, 2009. They wanted to develop a method to calculate the number of trays required to separate out volatile organic hydrocarbons, because that's a problem, particularly out west, where the bedrock is below the shale. So what ends up happening is these companies have, what they actually do in some places in Colorado and some of the surrounding areas, is they will actually install in your basement. And if you grab Craig, he'll talk about this probably for a very long time, because it's kind of like chemical engineering 101, a diffraction column. And what this column does is it basically sits there and takes the water that comes out of the ground and it moves it through a tray. The tray has pores. It gives air exposure to the water, and then the air is siphoned off. So we put in multiple trays, and that gives multiple levels in which the water is falling through, and there's like this constant exposure of the gas with the surface area and the compounds, and then you put a fan in and it blows it out. And that's what people have to do in those areas where they're able to light their water on fire, because it is a basic process associated with whatever they're doing, right? That's just part of their well water. Some well waters have high levels of methane, and some of those high levels are high enough to actually combust in air. So that's how you get your contamination issues, and that's another one of those things, along with the earthquakes, which it's technically true. We could theoretically contaminate drinking water wells, but from a real practical perspective, it has not happened, and it's not worth sitting there and banning fracking over. And the reason I brought this up for this week was just that somebody at work decided to raise that as Mike Pence is lying about this, or the Republicans are lying about this, that, or the next thing, and you're like, no, that's just not reality. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of that because they don't really dig into the science associated with fracking. It's actually pretty interesting stuff. But I think I've provided a couple of USGS links, and then you have the EPA study.
Yeah, I'll make sure
that you can link
that as well. Yeah,
I'll see if I can
already set up here. I've got the study, and I've got a brief out of an EPA archive that really just kind of breaks it down. And the brief is let me just bring it up and I'll just read it directly because it's really straightforward. I mean, even the headline itself is basically enough. EPA releases final report on impact from hydraulic fracturing activities on drinking water. EPA's report concludes that hydraulic fracturing activities can impact drinking water resources under some circumstances and identifies the factors that influence the impacts. So, as said, it can happen, but not really the most likely of things. But I'll have that link below.
No, it requires almost gross negligence on the part of the oil companies. That's not to say that's not to say that it can't happen, but it's not a justification for murdering an entire industry.
Yeah, not to say that it's... Well, it's not the last turn of the century when something like that very likely would have been the way it was done because they really didn't care and they needed to get the job done right away, and we didn't have the technology we have. But,
right. Well, there's that. We didn't know how to handle this stuff.
Yeah, we've got more than... fracking is, in and of itself, not even all that new. That's,
no.
I'm going to say, 70s? When that was
really pretty accurate, actually.
Kind of coming about?
I'd have to take a look at the exact date, but we've actually been doing it for a while. The major advantages that we have in terms of today and why it's come up today is actually horizontal drilling. So if you dig into it...
There's an interesting set of stories. I have heard some really shady stuff about some horizontal fracking with companies getting a little down and dirty with their business dealings, but, oil and gas companies are oil and gas companies, and you can't expect them to get a little down and dirty when you don't play ball.
Well, yeah, that's... the problem actually has to do with how we handle property rights.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. But a real long story short on that one is there's a couple of horror stories where some really unethical corporations will basically, they don't get the rights in the way they want, so they get the rights next door, and they go in at a bit of an extreme angle that's able to be accomplished now that wouldn't have been, even as much as 2 decades ago. And they can go in and get at the resources through some really shady means. And that kind of fucks up the image for the whole industry, too. Bad players fuck up any industry for anybody.
And that's absolutely true. So, at the end of the day, the way it works is... Hold on, just pausing for a moment because I'm trying to fend off the dog again. The way it works is U.S. mineral rights do not come necessarily with the land that you purchase above it.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And each state is different on that, too, so
that's also true.
That can get really weird and complicated. So, point of note on that, if you do have property... check on it and make sure you do have full rights to everything on your property.
Right, and this is not like ONG, mineral rights, mining, all of that stuff is actually not unique to that. It actually extends, if you start talking about the southern states, to water rights, and you run into the same problems there as you do with some of these Midwestern states with oil and gas and horizontal drilling and all the other stuff.
Listening, they will know all about water rights.
No, they actually so less so for them, but more so for Oklahoma, Ohio, all the other stuff. When you start talking about the things that, like environmental concerns that I actually have, it actually has to do with the water table, water basins, and water rights. And there was a group of people, I think it was T. Boone Pickens, who was moving away from his wind farms after he'd already reaped all the government subsidies and moving towards water rights not too long ago. I mean, it's been a few years since I looked into it, but water rights are handled very similar to mineral rights, wherein just because you owned X number of acres of farmland doesn't mean that you own the right to the water table below your farm. And so you could actually purchase those separately which some folks were doing with the intent of selling it back to the farmers because we've been kind of depleting our water faster than we've been replacing it. If you actually wanted to look at things that I would get on board with for national policies and infrastructure projects, a national water pipeline that connected to our underground reservoirs in the Great Lakes, I would be a huge, big fan of, because it is a risk for our farmland because we're actually pulling out more from our underground reservoirs than we are putting back in.
That's a fair argument. I'd like to find somebody that could actually talk on that. That might be something to explore in a future episode for sure.
It's interesting because I think that you could run it kind of similar to an exchange. Whereas if you turn around and you put in states like Michigan or whatever, with the Great Lakes, they pull in so much groundwater. If we built a national network of waterways and areas that can store water and pump water in, we would actually potentially have the ability for states to generate additional revenue selling from places like Michigan or Wisconsin or one of those other areas which are relatively poor to areas like California, so that California didn't have to deplete its natural resources and might actually be able to keep up with its engineered landscape issues associated with trying to run an entire civilization in the middle of a desert.
Yeah, fair point. But then again, we're also right on the edge of some cutting-edge desalination stuff. I've got something else to segue into, but this is a really good segue. Have you heard about the membrane filter?
They've been doing it. They've been doing it for a very long time. It's no different than your reverse osmosis stuff that you can get at Home Depot for your house. Right, it's all the same stuff. They're just improving the membrane each and every time. I think Koch Industries was doing something with it. I actually applied to a couple jobs there. I never got to interview with them, but they're working on that. Traditional desal plants tend to be a little bit more energy intensive because that's use
the biggest issue, from my understanding.
It is. That's accurate.
Well, you've got to boil off the water, and that's raw heat,
right?
And then you've got to separate out the salt, and salt, being what it is hard on everything.
So what you end up having to do, right, is you produce one stream that's potable water, and then you have one stream that is like hardcore brine saline.
Brine. Oh, yeah.
And it's like, what do you do with that, right? You can't just dump it back to the environment because you'll kill everything nearby. And you can't really,
There are some things that can be done with that, but
very little.
Yeah,
that's one of the
downsides. All of them are
you almost
be
have
very energy intensive in and of their own self. Anything you're going to want to do with that stuff, where it's not an industrial waste, but it's not far from one.
That's the. I would be okay with salination plants hooking into that thing, and then you just run it as a bid call system, like you do with the stock market, and people who have excessive amounts of water can sell it to people who don't.
Reasonable.
And I think that would be a great system for the nation as a whole to not only improve our water reserves, but also to allow the wealth transfer from states that aren't really doing so well with their water stuff. Again, I mentioned California, and I'm not trying to pick on them, but they are a desert trying to fund one of the second largest populations in the United States outside of New York City. And it would also allow our farming regions to significantly reinvest in their groundwater tables and probably help the overall farmers in places like Oklahoma, which is still kind of in Dust Bowl land from the 1930s because it never really recovered the topsoil layers and all the other stuff. But if you all of a sudden have cheap and abundant water, when you start talking farming, that would be something that might allow that state to recover economically from what ended up happening in the 1930s with the Great Depression. So that's my big infrastructure project, my thing that I see nobody ever talking about.
All right. right, let me drop a decent article about what basically is the new hotness, which of course carbon nanotubes, but it makes sense because that would be a very reasonable sieve. Like that could be done at a. I mean, you're going to need pressure, basically. That's theoretically a heatless system. I mean, other than just the heat of friction and motion.
I mean, ultimately, that's really what the goal of the reverse osmosis membranes is to turn it into a pressure system, and you still get your concentrated streams, but it's not a boiling hot liquid saltwater stream. Versus, you're basically talking about brine-ish stuff, which if you had the right estuary or you bled in enough salt water, it wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah, you're dealing with a much... Well, also, it's got to go through so much less to get where it ends up through like a carbon nanotube type of process. So
yep,
everything's just a lot cleaner, a lot neater, a lot nicer. It's kind of the, the step up from, say, fracking past the old turn of the century to where it is now. We can do really good, really clean work. And a lot more money has been put into that, even in the past, mysteriously in the past 3 to 4 years, that has really kind of advanced that even further. Who knows what happened in that last 3 to 4 years, but I'm told that the U.S. became a real leader in fracking for some mysterious reason.
It was something that's been going on for a little while. It was an overall shale boom.
That is actually true. I mean, I wouldn't know about so much of this if it wasn't something that has actually been going on. It's like if
you want to talk about things that screwed over Obama and his grand scheme and grand plans,
aside from
Solyndra, it was actually a lot of it had to do with natural gas and the fact that the oil and gas industry in the United States is incredibly resourceful. So when all of a sudden, so here's one of the cool things about the price of the barrel of oil, and I think I can't remember whether we talked about this or not. The last one we did in some of the post conversational stuff, but one of the things that both Craig and I are big fans of is not burning our hydrocarbon reserves because they're fantastic feedstocks. Right, we can run something called a Fischer-Tropsch process, and that allows us to convert lower chain hydrocarbons into higher chain hydrocarbons, right, which is the more useful stuff that feeds the polymer industry.
Yeah,
but at the same time, I think so. So what ends up happening at the end of the day when you start talking about something like fracking, fracking could turn into very high-end and high-value naphthalenes instead of us burning it. So the reason that we burn hydrocarbons has more or less to do with the fact that they're cheap to make, right? Because it's I mean, yeah, okay, so the feedstock from the oils.
That's why we burned wood for so long, and then why we burned coal for so long.
Exactly.
It's good. It's about as much heat and trouble as our technology at the time could handle.
Right. And it's cheap.
Yeah, and as that kind of goes into the discussion we were having before this, which we will need to definitely go into, but comparing fission to fusion.
Yep.
Once we're there, there's no turning back. We're going to be doing a system that's just way, way better, way denser fuel sources. I mean, you look at what you can do with one bottle of propane as compared to one log of exactly the same size. A camping bottle of propane and a log that is that big. I mean, you're going to have... You cut that log down to its smallest portions and get it down into rocket pellet fuel, and you're going to have a few minutes of fire. But, with a properly regulated burner, that one camping bottle of propane is going to last you all night, and you're going to cook a meal and have light. So it's...
Well, and that's kind of the thing, right? Like, what ended up thwarting Obama's plans is we as engineers, our job, a lot of people wonder what we do. Our job is fundamentally to make all of these crazy things cheaper and better and faster and safer, right? All of us are employed in the industry as a whole to basically make process improvements. And so what ended up happening was when gas prices skyrocketed, right? When the price of oil was hitting $120, $130 a barrel, right? There is a huge incentive to find ways to produce oil cheaper than $120 to $130 a barrel. And one of the ways that we can do that is converting lower chain hydrocarbon feedstocks into naphthalines and hydrocarbon feedstocks. And so what ended up happening is the reason the price of oil crashed is because we got so good at producing natural gas that we didn't need the oil in a lot of our burners for all of these other things. We started converting over, and then you start talking about coal. The reason coal plants aren't doing so well has nothing to do with the Democrats' war on coal. I mean, it does, but it doesn't really, right?
Right.
It has a lot to do with the actual cost of the fuel and the relative ease of conversion between a coal plant and a natural gas peaker plant, right? So we can turn around and we can take these cheap fuel stocks, and if you find a way to drill in and make better, cheaper, faster fuel, you get a huge advantage. And that's what ended up happening with fracking. Is we turn around where natural gas used to be 2 or 3 or 4, several times what its current price is. We found ways with horizontal drilling, with some of the fluids, to make the process so efficient and so quick that we could go into a field like North Dakota, drop a whole bunch of wells, and just basically, for almost nothing, print gas that was this really expensive commodity to use to heat everything. And the great thing about gas and oil and all of these other things is we can actually pipe them to wherever we need them to be. Again, I was talking about pipeline. Same thing applies for low chain hydrocarbons. Your methane, your propane, your butane, all of that stuff. It's easily piped between locations. And the easier, that means we have decreased transport costs, we have decreased, production costs. We can run this stuff through, we can up convert it, we can down convert it, we can do whatever we want with these hydrocarbon feedstocks. And you just can't stop that when all of a sudden your price of oil hits $120 a gallon, because I can build a Fisher-Tropsch plant. As long as oil is greater than $40 a gallon, that'll produce oil at approximately $40 a gallon. And I will...
A gallon?
All of these kinds... barrel.
Okay.
My bad.
No worries. I was thinking that did not sound right.
Nope, you're absolutely correct. You end up, when you start talking about fuels, you start thinking in gas gallon equivalents, or GGEs, and you're simultaneously trying to talk about barrels and barrel pricing, and it's this crazy conversion of units. So that's my bad. But yeah, no, at $40 a barrel, I can produce a Fisher-Tropsch process that converts methane from natural gas into oil feedstocks, right? And the thing is, here's the crazy part.
Just to clarify on that, by oil feedstocks, you mean something that's going to be able to be processed and refined, if not through the same process, but in a way like you would crude.
Similar, the oil...
I'm trying to generalize and just make this as understandable for somebody that's not understanding of any of these processes as possible.
Any hydrocarbon source can be converted to any other hydrocarbon.
Okay.
Right? We know how to do this chemically. Right? So all of these resources, whether it be oil, whether it be gas, whether it be coal, all of them are interchangeable from a chemical perspective. So the question is, how cheaply can we produce these individual feedstocks versus their final output? And that's the problem that you face when you see people like Obama, who wanted to sit there and jack up the prices of fuel by restricting oil drilling. Well, all of a sudden we can find all kinds of unique ways to access these reserves at a lower cost than what it costs to produce it from the well. And that's where you started getting some of these major changes, such as horizontal drilling, or horizontal, or the major, the which fed into the fracking boom, because now all of a sudden we could frack larger well spaces and get larger porosity. Because the old stuff from the 1970s, right, would basically have a vertical well, and we try to frack the area around that. As soon as we started putting in horizontal drilling, well, now we're fracking this huge area, and we're getting this huge amount of gas coming out of that area. And that's essentially what you ended up seeing.
That does make sense. That, and, with the large adoption at the same time, I mean, that basically put us... well, the timing was just all right there, wasn't it?
I mean, the price was right? The timing, we are an amazingly inventive species, assuming that there's enough.
Well, I should say the timing was
so.
Right for America to do that, basically, when it did.
That would be correct, yeah.
But, that brings to mind something really interesting that I know I've never discussed with you. So, George Bush, back in his day, there was, that's when stem cell research was really starting to kind of take off, and through one of his...
Last time I voted Democrat was based on stem cell research.
There you go. Well, you're going to get a kick out of this if you're not familiar. So, you're probably familiar with the fact that he banned stem cells based... Any research done through fetal stem cells was denied federal monies.
Yep.
And, if you were doing anything in your laboratory at all, in your facility, done, can't do it. Nothing. So, interestingly enough, they, that led to trying to find... I mean, there was a lot of work done down that line, too. But it's, to my understanding, it's a lot more work to take a fetal stem cell and make it into something usable, because you've got to take out everything in there that wants to turn it into what it wants to be. Because every one of those cells basically wants to grow into a human being. And what they found is these pluripotent stem cells that are a little bit more blank. And you can do work a lot easier with them, because they don't have... they've got a genetic imprint on them, but they're not... they haven't been programmed to task yet. So you can just kind of put them in place... And if the programming is right in place, they just start doing the work. So there's some...
So, sort of.
I'm really, really generalizing here. But the funny thing of that is, basically, this research into the pluripotent stem cells that are sourced differently than the fetal stem cells came just as a result of George Bush's...
The restriction on... Yep.
Stuff, which is ironic, and it just kind of shows you when you put a push onto engineers, they come up with a solution, and sometimes the solution's better than the original problem called for.
Well, and that's kind of the thing. When you started to talk about stem cells back in 2004, that's actually one of the that was literally an issue that I voted on. And so, essentially we had fetal cells, which were not that bad. It's not quite that the adult stem cells versus the fetal stem cells. The adult stem cells are better because they're not trying to adapt to everything. Fetal stem cells are technically better, but we improved what we were doing with the adult stem cells to the point where they were at least equally competent. And that did come about because of Bush's rulings. So where I thought that we were going to all of a sudden lose this great technology, well, all of a sudden we got at least the same technology without the moral hiccups, right, associated with fetal stem cells.
Well, and above and beyond that, too, this is a more generalized technology. It's, by its nature, going to be more universal. You don't need this one limited resource. You have a much bigger place to draw from, and
that's true. That's definitely true. So ultimately, The fetal stem cells are still technically more. There's more stuff we can technically do with them. But at the same time, they're
a limited resource, and they're a little harder to work with.
I don't know if they're harder to work with, actually. I really don't. So the really? Original stuff that so what I remember, and it's been a long time since I looked at stem cell research. There's a reason for that. Basically everything. So there were a lot of promises associated with stem cells. When you start looking at fetal cells, they can become anything, right? Whereas adult stem cells tend to have less potential to become anything. So if I took a smear of fetal cells and I applied them to an area that was damaged, they would generally grow in and conform to the area that was damaged and fix the organ. They would right the ship. They would conform to that stuff. Because what we found out, or at least the current theory associated with organ development and cell specialization, is that you'd have these fetal cell tissues which could become any organ. But what ends up happening is they basically respond to the concentration. So what you have, so let's say you wanted to develop a heart. I'll try to back this up.
Yeah.
How does your cells in the womb figure out that it wants to be a heart? Right? Well, at the end of the day, you start from this little blob of cells, and that's kind of crazy that you get to these organ specialties. So what ends up happening is one cell mutates, right? One cell mutates, and it says, I am a brain cell, right? And that brain cell tells all the other cells around it that it wants them to be brain cells too, right? So this initial brain cell is putting out this compound which says, hey, become this. That will form the brain, and then all of a sudden the spine says, hey, I'm looking to attach to brain cells. Here's these brain cells. You need to become this, right? And the same thing kind of happens all the way throughout the body, where everything is kind of based on the concentration of specialized cell X, it becomes specialized cell Y. And that's how we get the formation of people. So if I have a heart, right, and I've got specialized cell A and specialized cell B, I will, my section of the heart that I want to be working on as a cell says there's this concentration of compound A and this concentration of compound B, so therefore I have to be Z, right? And that's kind of how stem cells work. So fetal stem cells are technically more adaptive, but what ended up happening once we implemented this ban was that people started working at ways of kind of reverse engineering adult stem cells, whereas if I would take something from, say, your spinal cord, right, it will grow in general at the time, it would grow in and become a spinal cell, right? It had the ability to be any cell within a certain range. And then we found a way to kind of take the cuffs off and take adult stem cells and allow them to be pluripotent, which is what the fetal cells were, and we didn't have the resource issues or the morality issues of harvesting fetal tissue. But the fetal cells are still technically better, but at the same time, we don't have to deal with like graft versus host issues. We don't have to deal with any of the other issues associated with ethics. We don't have to deal with the rare resource issues. So adult stem cells end up becoming the better research path, and we didn't know that until Bush technically put us on that path.
Now, here's one you may not be familiar with. There's another pluripotent stem cell source that's been... this one, they kind of skirted the line, and it's like, here's the letter of the law. Okay, cool. This is exactly what the law says? Okay, we can work with that. So they went with umbilical cord blood and umbilical cord stem cells. And they're really good. They're like a fetal cell, but they're a little more blank. So this has been kind of another avenue that was pursued down that line. And with these, you kind of get the best of both worlds amongst those, because they're using those adult processes, but on a more blank slate kind of pluripotent stem cell, so it's that much more effective,
You know what? I'll have to trust you on there.
I'll see if I can get some resources on that, but the whole field's really fascinating, and we'll really have to go into this when we get into our age is just a disease.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look into it a little bit more. So like I said, it was a big voting issue for me in 2004. That was 16 years ago, and I have seen nothing of interest out of that field since. Right? Like it is high on promise and low on delivery. And that kind of irks the crap out of me. But that's been my biggest issue with that field is they were promising, like I remember seeing Good Morning Americas and stuff like that where they're showing the formation of livers and hearts and all this. None of that went anywhere. We still aren't printing organs. We're not far away from it.
Actually, that is untrue. We are printing organs now. But I don't think it's still in testing, but I mean, it is being done. And as a matter of fact, some of the first ones were done in Brazil. But that's been years back. But no, we actually, I don't know if anybody's received one yet, but they have been made. And as a matter of fact, I think they're using the pluripotent stem cells to kind of fill in the blanks, because what's being done is they're printing out the like a matrix of the organ, and then basically putting that in place with whatever your DNA blueprint would be to get it to fill it in. I mean, it seems incredibly reasonable, and if you're going from there too, if you're going to print somebody a new heart, say they've got a defect, well, you're building it up from the ground, build it without the defect. Build it like Lance Armstrong's. Why not? If you're putting a new one in, fix the problem.
I mean, if they've advanced the field, and I'm not aware of it,
actually,
I'm really happy to see that.
We will really, we're gonna have to get into.
But the way they were selling
stuff, there's some really wild stuff that's been going on, because this is a personal area of interest of mine as well.
I think let me try to recharacterize my statement. I lost interest in the field because the promises that they were making in 2004 for how close they were to these kind of immortality projects fell through. Right? If 16 years later they've gotten to the point where they're printing organs, that's fantastic. But they were promising that they were like months to a couple of years away from doing that in 2004. Right? So they're merely they're like a decade behind. And so when I voted for them,
kind of like fusion. Anyway,
that was my take on it. I got really upset about it.
Oh no, that's because I was. I mean, that's putting the future in your hands, literally. It's like
right. It's
like watching that first the first Falcon rocket land.
Yeah,
it's one of those kind of things,
And they, I remember them bringing on their scaffolding and doing all this other stuff, and you're like, oh man, that's really cool. So I'll be able to get heart transplants, and we'll be able to save people's lives, and it just never happened.
Of me that you've got to put on life support. No weird ethical issues. No more of that. Whatever's going on in China of human organ harvesting and whatever. Yeah.
If I ever get wealthy enough to the point where I can harvest my own cells and create a clone that I can get a brain transplant into, it's totally going to happen. There'll be a 13-year-old version of me. I might have to save up for it, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the ethics of like cloning. I have no issue with that. It's spare parts. It wouldn't exist without me.
If you can. You build it without you build it with the very most basic things required for life support and no higher functions. Otherwise, you're getting into the territory of playing God, and I don't actually take issue with that, but a lot of people do. So it's easier to just play it safe on that thing.
I mean, I would never want to see higher functions in anything, right? Because life is precious. But at the same time, if you turned around and you grew something that, because we can hook something up to like a heart-lung machine, and everything will keep on going, right? Your brain's not that necessary.
Yeah, I mean,
so
we
if you
really do have the technology now to keep a vegetable going.
Right. So if like we blenderized
any level of vegetative state.
You know, if I needed replacement parts, right? And I knew that it was going to be, I mean, even if it was a 13, 14-year growth phase before I could get a full brain transplant, right? But Clone Steve, I'd be okay with Clone Steve's brain being blenderized and just hooking him up to a machine and growing him out to the point where I can move my brain from between me to Clone Steve.
Well, you know, or if that one doctor gets the head transplant thing, you know, taken care of, you know, maybe not even have to do it that hard, you know, just a nip tuck, as it were. A little snip here, a little, you know, so
you know, I don't know. I think it would be really cool to get my brain transplanted into a teenage version of myself. I would actually be okay with that, right? Like, you get to go back through high school knowing everything that you know.
Dealing with your hormones again, though.
I would love it. I really, like, don't get me wrong, like, my hormone levels are relatively consistent, and my wife will complain up and down till the day is nigh here about how much I hound her. But I look back on my days and I go, yeah, I know what I used to be able to do, right? 11 times a day, that was good for me. Now I'm like 4 and I'm done. So I'd be okay with going back to that. Like, I think it would be a lot of fun to relive your teenage years with all the hormones and all the craziness and all the bullshit with a little bit more, like, life experience in how to handle it.
Well, I mean, that's kind of
I think that'd be fun.
I mean, that's even been a trope in how many movies. But yeah, no, that is reasonable. But kind of getting back onto the other topic I was wanting to talk about here. Boy, we kind of got out of here, but it falls back to the fracking and poison and weird message. Never mind. So yeah, ignore the clicks. All right. But the new North Korean missile. This thing
I have not seen anything on that.
Giant. Okay, I have it up in another window here. I will link you right away.
I've been stunningly surprised that North Korea hasn't launched any crazy missiles yet. That a lot of that stuff, like, Trump managed to actually get them to cool their jets a little bit.
Seems like. So, once you get this up, let me know when you get it down to when they've actually got the video of the thing. And just in the first few moments, you'll actually see it. And let me know when you're there. It's like 3 seconds in, and you can just pause it. You can see this big old honking stupid missile.
I think I saw, like, a thumbnail of it, but unfortunately I have 30 seconds of advertisement. Which is just fantastic, but...
Well, it kind of doesn't matter. It'll just... I'll go ahead and go into my explanation of some interesting things that I've learned about this in the meanwhile. So this is based on an old Soviet design. Surprise, surprise. And it's a liquid-fueled rocket. So you know much about rocketry?
Little bit.
All right, well, a liquid-fueled rocket... they require a significant amount of infrastructure. You can't safely store them with the fuel because some of the fuel...
That is a big-ass fucking missile.
It is. It is.
I mean, all missiles are kind of big-ass. Like, real missiles, ICBMs, real ICBMs are big-ass.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Oh, yeah, no, it is an impressive display, but...
Now, I would make the argument that I would caution anybody who actually watches that video that it is a North Korean missile, so that doesn't mean it actually flies. But
well, yeah, you're gonna be interested in this. So, the breakdown, as I'm to understand it here, when this is gonna, I mean, it's big as shit. It's gonna require a lot of fuel, and if it's not using a solid fuel, then it's not safe to transport that thing fueled up and ready. So you're going to need fuel trucks. You're going to need big fuel trucks. So there's not really a way that this can be a rapidly deployed kind of thing.
No.
So
I mean, none of what Korea does.
It kind of defeats the point of what they're trying to demonstrate here. They're trying to show we've got this big badass missile that we can rapidly deploy on these trucks. Really, they kind of can't. The best they could hope for is to have an installation at which they could rapidly deploy these. And considering that their testing hasn't really shown them to have really the technology to make this go, it's pretty much infeasible. But yeah, I'll link the Reuters article for everybody here as well. But I kind of wanted to get into that and kind of get your thoughts on it too, because I mean, you're a knowledgeable guy in this sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I think you covered it pretty well, right? The first thing that I turned around and said here was, just because it's a really big ass missile and they loaded it on a truck doesn't mean that it fucking works, right? That's the thing. North Korea missiles are like a 50-50 shot as to whether they even go up, right? And then
fair, yeah.
On top, so this is not particularly surprising. If they're going to use a liquid fuel, that's not the best choice. You get better volumetric expansion from solid fuel rockets, but who cares? My larger concern is actually some of the more modern Russian design of missiles. Have you seen any of the nuclear missiles?
I have not, but I'm hearing talk about these hypersonic missiles that are pretty interesting.
Yeah, so the first thing that we have to talk about is actual defenses of the nation, right? This is stuff that I can talk about because it's not something I actually work on or see at the lab. Do you know how the United States is shielded?
I know we've got a missile grid, like something akin to the Patriot system, right?
No, that's bullshit. That's the shit that they sit there and they present to you and say, hey, look, we have a 50-50 shot of shooting down the missile with this system. But the military always operates on a defense in depth measure. So we have our first line, our second line, our third line. Our primary missile defense system is actually a series of lasers. We have them here. We have them in Japan. We have them everywhere else. I actually know a guy who worked on installing some of these systems. I
couldn't say anything about it, so I'd love for you to go in depth.
Well, I know very little about it because it's kind of right. So the short is, I think they're like gigawatt-ish lasers, but that's essentially what we install into our allies and we install into ourselves. And so we sit there and we talk about this Patriot missile system, and it's fucking bullshit, right? Yes, the Patriot missile has a 50-50 shot of actually shooting down a missile. I'm sure it's probably a little bit higher than that, right? But the military doesn't want to take blame for failing. Either way, that the primary method of defense of the United States is lasers, because we can shoot things in space. We can shoot things that are as soon as it crosses the horizon, right? We can shoot it, which means anywhere
is
between
essentially a line of sight shot.
Right, exactly. And so you start talking about ICBMs. They just by their very design, they end up having to have high arcs. So we can pick these things up thousands of miles away when they're just at like low Earth orbit area and take them out. The big problem is the missiles that are coming out of Russia. So this North Korean thing actually doesn't spook me that much because it's just a traditional missile, and we have a laser.
It's not even going to be particularly fast or well working, so it wouldn't.
Right.
It's not going to be doing anything unexpected.
Right. If we turn around and they launched it and they decided to launch it towards Japan, Japan is probably shielded heavily enough that they can take it out from Japan. They probably don't fire the system all that much because, again, we don't want our, you don't want to expose what your capabilities are. And for the most part, North Korea just does, a beating of the chest. They're not actually taking out targets. There's no launch path typically has that, yada, 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 right? if we wanted to shoot down the North Korean missile, we can. So it doesn't scare me. It doesn't bother me. It probably won't even take off because of all of the things that you mentioned and more, right? What does scare me is the Russian nuclear missiles, right? And I don't mean nuclear in terms of their warhead. They have a nuclear drive technology that they're using. And this is able to propel the missiles so fast that they generate a plasma shield around them. Literally, it's just they ionize the air around the tip of the missile, and it produces a plasma. And we're not entirely sure our lasers can shoot through them. That is what scares me.
I've only heard about this kind of in passing.
It
sounds a little creepy.
It is very impressive, and it highlights the. So when you sit there and you see people talking about wind or solar or whatever, relative energy lengths, as soon as you start talking about military technology, that's where nuclear shines. And I don't mean that that's the only place nuclear can shine, but the cutting edge crap that's coming out of our foreign adversaries is always nuclear tech. Always is nuclear tech. And the Russians developed a nuclear engine on one of their rockets, and it has the ability to travel hypersonically and generate a plasma shield. It's crazy. I don't know much more than that, but that scares me. The North Korean rocket that will go up with a chemical warhead, and that they get to parade around their population, which is obligated to show up and wave flags and cheer for it. Yeah, I'm not super scared. So what? It's a big missile.
I've got a link for that, by the way. I will include that in the show links, and I'll actually drop it for you here if you want to check it out. It's out of Defense News. Apparently, they've had a recent successful test.
They've had several. You see Zircon?
Yeah, this one's.
Yeah, Zircon always means nukes.
9 times the speed of sound on a range of 1,000 kilometers. It's
a nuclear.
Not an incredibly far range for a nuclear weapon, but for this is basically like an incredibly powerful tactical cruise weapon.
Yeah.
As cruise weapons go,
right?
It's kind of in the middle range, but its capabilities are horrifying.
You think tactical, you think nuclear weapons, right? And you think ICBMs, and this North Korea missile is like in that category. No. We don't launch nuclear weapons from our silos in the middle of Nevada. That would be a stupid place to launch a nuclear weapon from. Our nuclear weapons are launched from bombers and from subs, and those are located in strategic points around the world, right? That's where we launch a nuclear weapon from. So when you start talking about something that is a cruise missile, they could launch from that, I guarantee you they can launch that from a submarine. And all they have to do is get close enough. So you say it's not a terribly long range, and that may be true, but it doesn't have to be.
No, absolutely not. I mean, if you can... Well, this one's launched from a carrier, but, if you can launch it from a carrier, you can adapt a sub.
Absolutely.
And
even if they launch it from
just about anywhere.
Even if you launch a carrier fleet, right? So what did they give for their range of the missile? Hold on, I gotta pull it up.
Listing on here was 1,000 kilometers.
So 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles. So do you know what the range of projection is of a naval fleet? It's about 500 miles.
Fair enough.
That's the maximum range of power projection. So that means that if we had a nuclear fleet en route to engage their nuclear fleet, this thing has 120 miles greater range than their nuclear fleet before we could stop it. Right? So you got to look at it from that perspective. Now, again, I know what our technology is, or some of what our technology is, and I there's certain things that we can talk about and certain things we can't talk about. But that is what scares me. Because they can launch this 620 miles away, and we can't easily project power into their carrier.
Basically, they've got a gun that shoots farther than we do. right now, and we don't know if we can shoot down the bullet.
I wouldn't go as far as saying that. I'm
not saying they don't have all the guns that will fire farther than ours, but just that they have a gun that fires farther than some of ours.
Let me rephrase. They have a gun that fires farther than our military is willing to openly admit on the unclassified side. What it gets to.
Fair. Well,
right. I don't know what the exact range of our projection of power is, but the what is publicly admitted to is about 400 to 500 miles, and that's 620. So could we engage it? I don't know, but it's still scary, right? 620 miles is not terribly far away from a coastline.
No.
You know what I mean? Right? Like, you don't have to be... So, yeah, you're not at ICBM range, right? But you're from New York to South Carolina.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a pretty dangerous range. Like, that's a big chunk of the East Coast. That's theoretically a big chunk of the South, big chunk of the West Coast.
It is so for most people who are listening, if you were on a highway and you traveled for 10 hours straight, that's about the distance that this thing travels at. So just think about that. Where can you get in a 10-hour drive from where you are? And most of us are going to be able to sit there and do things like, for me, it would be like New York to pretty close to like Virginia or South Carolina. I think we could probably hit that in about 10 hours. But yeah, it's not a short range, and it's kind of scary.
No.
Again, now, can't speak to whatever the Navy has as a capability of projection of power, but 620 miles is not short.
No, and this is it's not a gun, and they're going to only have limited amounts, but there's a lot. Say you've got two of these. That allows you to disable whatever force is coming to stop you, because you can fire a little bit farther, and that gives you one more to do a lot of damage with.
Again, I wouldn't go that far.
No, I'm just trying to put things in a kind of an understandable perspective.
Because you can look at things like the Phalanx defense system, and I'm pretty sure that could shoot it down, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, you've just got.
Are you familiar with Phalanx?
Oh yeah. It's
yeah.
Yeah,
That's
it's really cool. Like right. just a badass Gatling gun. Love it.
Yes, and there's like that will put enough rounds in the air that there's very little coming through that. But I would be far more concerned if they were to sit 620 miles away and go for that as a first strike option, because again, we're primarily shielded by lasers, and given that we are primarily shielded by lasers, and this thing actually generates a plasma shield around it, it means that we are not entirely convinced that we can shoot it down. Whereas the North Korean missile, we can blow out the second that thing appears above the horizon to us.
Yeah, and we also don't know the exact capabilities of the recently deployed railguns either. And I mean, they might be able to deal with something like this like it's nothing too. But,
did they actually deploy the railguns? I didn't know. I know that they've done the testing. Is there one in the field?
There is one in the field. I don't know of more, but I know one has been deployed. And from what I understand, actually, some of the lasers are now... There are a few lasers in the air now.
Actually, I don't think there are.
I'm pretty sure there are, actually.
There used to be. There used to be.
I'll have to look that up, because that's kind of a whole
those planes down.
Too. Really?
Yeah, they actually took those planes down, yeah. You are absolutely correct. That was a completely legitimate missile defense system. Anybody who's played Call of Duty, you got your Spectre gunship, where you get to play with a gigantic explosion turrety thing. They basically took out that gun system and replaced it with a 1,500 megawatt laser or something like that. It was crazy. I have no idea how they generated that much power in an airplane. Like, absolutely none, because it's ridiculous what they could do. And those things could shield the country. We had, what was it? 1 on the Atlantic coast and 2 on the Pacific coast or something like that. And that shielded the entire nation with 3 of those planes, which we kept up in the air essentially in perpetuity. But then we turned around and grounded the planes.
Not to say that we couldn't reinstitute something like that, but, one would imagine that we wouldn't mothball something like that without something to replace it,
Well, again, don't forget, right? When you start talking about geopolitics, the reason that we, as the United States, so this is one of the hard parts for me as a libertarian, right? I very firmly oppose the intervention in foreign wars and Middle Eastern affairs and all that stuff. I'm not a big fan of that. But at the same time, the larger scale the U.S. presence has, the more technology we can put in allies and regions that we kind of want to cover. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure.
So if a perfect example is Japan, right? Japan is our ally through and through. I think they just started getting their own armed forces in the last 20 years or something like that.
Oh, not even that. I mean, they were only allowed a self-defense force. Abe himself has actually kind of revolutionized that just in the last, I want to say 8 years.
Yeah, it's not very long, and certainly they're not running with the same level as our Navy, right? But why would I have 3 planes on station all the time as a primary line of defense, right, to shield me from Russia, China, and North Korea, which are our big threats overseas, when I can put 2 of those fucking ground-based lasers in Japan, not just shield Japan, but the entire United States hemisphere from that area.
Oh yeah, you're pretty much covering China by doing that too, and that
exactly.
that eliminates a major threat. And that's not to say that said installations don't already exist.
Well, and that would be my assumption. As we were
talking about just a bit ago.
That would be my assumption. You're absolutely right. We wouldn't ground those planes. Right. We would not ground those planes unless we had something else covering their duty station. And I am sure that we probably do, and it's probably a ground-based defense system, which is more capable than whatever the lasers on the planes were. But you start talking about the actual energy outputs of those the laser weapons that we had on the planes, and that's crazy.
Yeah, that in and of itself is actually a really interesting thing. I'd like some more info on as well, because that's a lot of power, and it's not in a lot of space.
Yeah, it's a megawatt level system. Like that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of energy.
Yeah, I mean if anybody happens to listen to this and has any information on that, definitely get in touch with any one of us, because that's a conversation I'd love to have.
I can tell you straight up from the folks that I know that have worked on some of these installations, you won't. What is, again, you start talking about some of this military stuff, and we can talk about it at a very high level with kind of what's publicly available, but you will never hear anybody who has ever broached any of that stuff. Like, I will never talk about anything that I know is classified, right? Anything that I've ever seen at the lab, I'll never talk about. Oh, anything that some of my friends have seen in their installations, they'll never talk about more than, yeah, we can shoot that down, right? That's about the extent. And you start talking about these megawatt laser systems, such as, what is it? This I got the laser plane pulled up. It's the YAL-1, right? That's publicly available on Wikipedia. And they're talking about a megawatt level laser system. That's a lot of energy, dude. That's a lot of energy.
I mean, that's concentrated in more than a lot of submarines are putting out.
I don't know what submarines are putting out. And If I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Fair. And I haven't done all the research myself, but to my understanding of their systems requirements, they shouldn't have need of much more, because, I mean, basically all they are is just launch platforms and one engine for making the thing run, and then something else to rebreathe the oxygen. So, they don't honestly have huge energy needs.
According to the Seawolf class listed on Wikipedia, it is a 34 megawatt system. That is what is advertised.
Okay, well, that's a fairly dense system.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, it's surprisingly dense. Well, okay, then it might stand to reason that they crammed a subsystem in there.
I mean, that's the thing. You start talking about so we're talking about this YAL-1, right?
Yeah.
And they're not telling you, if you go through the Wikipedia article, they're not very clear as to what the exact megawattage output of that laser is. But I really struggle to believe that there's anything other than some sort of significant nuclear reactor powered on that sub, or on that plane.
No, it
right? We know that we can do it.
That's a mature technology, and just as we're looking at this, it's a mature technology, and it's already been deployed for years. So,
yep,
it stands to reason. I mean, even if we can't say exactly what it is, it's probably something along those lines, or at least along from those lines of research. Yeah,
so it's it looks like they grounded the weapons platform after 2013, 2014 for the airplane.
All right. I think a lot more I don't know. That might tie in with what I had heard about some of the rods from God stuff starting to be deployed as well. Because that gives you a completely different angle of attack on those things. Because, you could just take out an institution. Or an installation, institution.
I am all for seeing some evidence that we actually decided to use rods from God. I don't believe that we put anything up there like that. That being said, if somebody came out and said, oh no, here's the actual documentation showing that we have tungsten rods in space that we can fire at any city at any time, I wouldn't say, yeah, no, that's not possible. I just don't know. You start talking about dealing with a military culture, and you'll see conspiracy theories out there all over the place. The reality is the military is its first and foremost principal duty is to protect people and protect our environment and all of that other stuff. So I really struggle to believe that we would start disobeying international law for a small strategic advantage.
When you put it like that, it really doesn't sound very believable.
And that's the thing is,
I'm honestly more incredulous now even than I would have been before about that. No, I absolutely would think so. Aside from some of the things, you'd be
surprised.
Yeah.
We put up. You see movies and TV, and they fluff it up to be like the military is action first, and I'm sure there's some truth to that.
I would say that's actually not been the case up until fairly recently. It's been very micromanaged.
It really is. Time. The actual principle, like I am as an individual who gets to work for the United States military, it is a privilege and an honor. It really is. They're amazing people to work for. They treat you well, and their primary focus is on, making sure that everybody's safe and everybody's healthy, to a fault, right?
Right.
Like that's an actual thing that they do. So you start talking about violating international law. I don't see that happening.
Well,
you start talking about,
I have some things that I'm not under any sort of legal reason to say or not say, but I've got a couple of veteran friends, and we can say that some things happen that shouldn't happen, and they just do, and it doesn't necessarily end up in people being dead or anything, but there's a lot that happens that's just not really on the books, or there's a job that's got to get done, and it gets done.
And that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. But at the same time, I just don't see that being... A job getting done is different than a weapons platform in space. Right?
Well, a job is a job. Sometimes that job is, installing a highly classified, military system that can do things that are undisclosed. Maybe so, maybe no.
Maybe. I have the utmost respect for the military, and I don't doubt that if we absolutely had to, we would. Because, their primary purpose is to serve the United States. But I just don't see that being... Like, we have so many weapon systems. And they are so capable. Why would you risk...
We have the best weapon systems, folks. The best. Big league weapon systems.
It is bigly.
Huge.
Bigly weapon systems. Huge weapon systems. But, I mean, I just don't... Like, when you start talking about what we have... The United States has been number one in technology for decades.
Well, that's actually been kind of the driving ethos of our military might, not so much necessarily having more guys or necessarily even better trained guys. Just we've got the tech that's just we're going to bury you with our really badass bombs and guns.
Right, and
from there we can get into some really not as fun arguments about dead brown people, but that's another conversation for another day.
It would be. But I mean, and that's kind of the thing, right? I really struggle to believe that given the nature of the weapon systems that they have publicly disclosed, assuming that there is an entire layer on top of that of stuff that is not publicly disclosed, right? And I don't, most people don't get to see that kind of stuff. The stuff that's truly like cutting edge. That stuff is worked on in compartmentalized groups, so no individual has access to all of the reports for any individual system, right? So even if I actually worked on something special, I wouldn't be able to tell you everything about it, because that's how they break it down. And that's because of spies like Chimak and some of the other stuff. You can't concentrate that information. But the stuff that we've publicly discussed... why would we put a weapons platform in space if we have all of these other things that we've talked about, like the YAL-1? Yeah, okay, we retired that. But you and I both know that they put something else in place that covered the airborne laser anti-ballistic missile defense system, right? So we know that something's out there. We don't know what it is. We don't need to know what it is. We just know that it exists and it's better than the YAL-1.
No, sure enough.
Right?
Yeah, let's just hope it's not built by Cylindra. But bump. I had to go back to that. It's good. It's good. I had to. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
Coming out with the
but
singers fast and furious.
Why would we turn around and put rods from God in space? Right? That's a tremendous expense for very little gain when we already have all of these ground-based, sea-based, or, air-based weapons platforms, which can do the same thing. I don't understand why we would do that.
Well, the same thing isn't exactly accurate, but it's an interesting argument. And again, this is something that the last time we actually talked about it, I had said I need to get somebody who really has the knowledge about it. And I don't know enough to say. What I know is basically through secondary research, and I haven't followed up enough, so we'll just kind of have to revisit this one.
Fair enough.
But having said that, let me see here.
We've
gone over the probably not impressive Nork missile.
North Korea. You try so hard.
Hey, they do. Well, trying to impress the big cool orange guy that everybody loves so much. Oh, here's something. This literally just came through. Let me see here. Yeah, a new Nobel nomination just came in. Yesterday.
So what's that? 4 or 5?
4. Let me see here. From Finland. In recognition of the endeavor to end the era of endless wars, which, I mean, say what you will, America has been at war about as long as I've been alive.
Yep.
In some form or another. This is the first time
You know what? I am so glad that Trump fired John Bolton.
Yes.
I thought it was a mistake to hire him. I hated when he was a commentator on Fox News. May actually be one of the principal reasons why I stopped watching Fox News. But ultimately, you know, I'm really glad that Trump is, you know, if Biden gets in, we're like all of the hopes of anybody who was anti-war is going to just go away.
Oh yeah,
because I'm sure he will put us into everything.
Oh yeah, I was talking to one of the authors I follow, I should say one of my mutuals that's an author on Twitter. I probably wouldn't have followed this guy out of the blue, but he followed me, and way back when, before the world was as fiery and insane as it is. Then, well, he's since he's just gotten a hint of the derangement syndrome, shall we call it. And that being said, he doesn't like to listen to reason. I was trying to talk to him like, hey man, I'm voting anti-war. I don't want any more dead Americans, and I don't want any more dead brown people. And somehow this has become a far-right position. And that's the most astounding thing to me. Like, I came up listening to KMFDM. Old industrial music. I have no idea what that is. Oh, man. Like, hard industrial. And they are heavy duty against war. Like, World Wars, everything. They were hard against George Bush. And that's understandable. He was, he was good buddies with old Michael Bolton. They were crooning out a tune together. If anyone gets that reference, I'm sorry.
But, I was talking to my wife about this very thing, like TDS and the whole bit. And I was actually we were hiking out today in the Adirondacks because it's gorgeous, and I'm so lucky to live where I do. But we were talking about this today, and I was sitting there and I was saying, I don't understand how it is that you run into these people who have TDS. Right? I didn't phrase it that way because she's not as hip to the culture war. So terms like TDS would probably not register. But I was saying that, and basically, her point was how many people end up digging into this, whether it be the peace deals or the fine people hoax or whatever have you. And this is, I think, the real curiosity for the election is this is going to be a referendum largely on how many people do as they're told versus how many people actually seek out independent sources and verify their own information. And that's going to be very interesting to me because if Biden wins, I'm going to have it's probably going to shatter any hope.
Mainstream media, really. That, all of this, all these lies that people have been fed for years, really. And not even the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, this has been building for quite some while. The cracks started to show, honestly, about 6 years ago. And that is even to say that the cracks started to show where enough people noticed them. I mean, the cracks have been showing for a while. The system's been deeply flawed and broken for an age.
Well, postmodernism was the thing that I came into the culture war on, right? Like, I think we've talked about it before. I came in on Gamergate, and I came in on Gamergate specifically because people were actively, basically talking about misinformation. And, that's probably
Gamergate started Hitler,
Of course it did. It resurrected him from his grave.
Gamergate did 1619.
What?
I don't even know what that fucking means.
Yeah, I don't either. 1619 is... Oh, the 1619 project?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I'm assuming that's what you were referencing. That's just the dumbest thing ever. I think that there's actually a collection of scholars that are seeking to have all of the rewards associated with it retracted.
Really?
Because it was inaccurate. Yeah, there was something not too long ago where a series of historical scholars and journalists were petitioning to have their prize, their Pulitzer, retracted because they have open and blatant falsehoods. I would love to see it. I don't think it'll happen.
Well, I mean, some while ago we were talking about the hoax that was pulled on all the scientific papers that were just pushing garbage as long as it pushed the popular narrative, where they were able to get sections of Mein Kampf put through. They just changed the Jew mentions to men, which is horrifying and ironic.
Well, and that's what concerns me, right? Like, at the end of the day, I am anti-democrat. Sucklove's, yeah, that's because of the original guy who did this back in the 1990s, who was criticizing postmodernism, did that. But that's my biggest concern. That's really my biggest concern, because at the end of the day, if we continue down this path, this is a full-blown communication breakdown. We have people who are outwardly lying, whether we're talking about something like as simple as fracking, which is a very interesting topic, which we talked about for probably about an hour. But realistically, we have politicians who are openly saying that we should ban an industry, an entire industry, everybody's jobs, all of this other stuff, for something that has no practical impact on anyone's lives. And you're diving into these statements of half-truths and outright lies. That is a huge concern for me for this election. Really. Well, and that's, yeah, I agree. That's a huge concern for me. And
sometimes from both sides of the argument, because people don't want to be honest about it, because the honest truth is a little ugly, and, well, if it's a little ugly, you just can't tell people because they might say no, instead of educating people on the dangers and the troubles, which is kind of why things got so bad with COVID so many places, because we didn't really educate people on what they had to deal with, so things got out of hand more quickly than they should have. Like, this should have been contained to Wuhan, and the world rises up to say, don't worry about this, China. We got your back. You take care of that, and we'll take care of you, and everything goes all hunky-dory, and everybody's all friendly-like. But no. China got a China.
China's always going to China, right? Like,
let's hope for not much longer, because this bullshit has really pissed a lot of people off, and I would really like to see them get their own Gorbachev, and, tear down that wall.
There are two things that I'm really hoping for. So first off, I think we can all kind of admit that Trump didn't actually come through with a legitimate message during his debate, right? I am really hoping to see
Biden-Trump debate. No, all that was really, it wasn't on the topics. What was that display in that was the capacity.
It was a pissing contest. It was a pissing contest between two 70-year-old men.
Okay, well, there's a lot more on it than that, but I mean, if you want to lose a couple of you're cutting out at least a couple of the baby's toes with the bathwater here, if not the whole baby. Okay? Fair enough. But I mean, there's a lot of nuance that you're leaving behind in that explanation. But okay, fair enough to save us some time.
I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you that there is indeed more stuff that went on there, but I think that we can all agree that he didn't present a vision. And what I really want to hear him talk about is how he's planning.
Neither men did.
I want to see him talk about how I don't care who does it, right? I want to see who's going to sit there and start talking about decoupling with China. right? I want to see our actual economy decoupled with China. I don't want to be reliant on them. I don't want to be dedicated to them. I don't want to have our components manufactured by them. So whoever is going to decouple from China is a significant component of my vote.
Well,
the second thing that I want to see,
personal safety and national safety. So I mean, it's something that nobody wanted to talk about before, because when you're dealing with the world's manufactory, it's just cheaper to deal with the world's manufactory and not build your own, infrastructure. You can even let yours fall apart and then find that one day when something really bad happens, all your important shit is manufactured by someone who isn't exactly your friend.
And that's a huge issue, and we haven't fixed it yet. I mean, I understand and I accept that it takes longer than what, 9 months to fix it. I accept that, right? But I do want to see Trump talk about decoupling from China. I also want to see Trump sitting there, or anybody. Again, this is an anybody thing. I'm just emphasizing Trump because I think that he's more likely to dive into this side of the issue than is Biden. But I want to see that. I want to see him do a decent pushback against neo-Marxism and the postmodernist left, right? And he utterly failed this point. He was even asked about his ban on critical race theory, and he failed the question.
I think the large issue with that is I don't know if he understands fully.
I agree.
The nature of that hydra, if you will.
But he banned it. So
I mean,
if
he's
he
doing the right thing.
He is.
But he doesn't appreciate. I can't imagine that the man appreciates just what a danger critical theory and critical race theory really are. And I mean, really, to understand it, you got to get deep out into the weeds. You really do.
If you start talking about the Trump's Myers-Briggs, at the end of the day, like, he is not particularly fact-obsessed, and he's not particularly an in-depth guy. He's very much surface-level issues, surface presentation. He makes quick judgments.
Well, he's a guy that
very,
runs businesses.
very good on his feet. Yeah, he's absolutely.
So he's wired for that sort of thing, and the stuff that he's going to get deep on are going to. We really don't know what he gets deep on, and I would love to know. I really would love to know what sort of intellectual hobbies the man has, because that would be a fascinating tell for how his mind really works.
Well, I think, if you dive into your Myers-Briggs stuff, right? So your MBTI scores, he comes across as, or Trump's been rated as what's known as the entrepreneur, right? And if you actually read through that whole entire thing, it's not that you're dumb, but you're not particularly interested in the details, right? Where somebody like myself, I really love the details. And if you don't give me details, I will hammer you until you do. But Trump wants a surface overview, so most likely he was probably told on critical race theory it's a racist thing, and the national labs are doing this crazy thing where, I think what it was,
well,
it
was
something.
Get an honest breakdown of critical. Well, let me see if I can do this so that I could maybe present it in a way that it could be presented in a quick and dirty that a person could understand. So, critical race theory, to really boil it down and kind of lose a bit of the baby with the bathwater, is to say that it's almost an exclusively anti-white thing, because it takes into account no context and no location. So, like, critical theory is critical race theory. Critical theories, there's I don't even know if you can effectively boil that down. That would have to be something we'd have to have a whole discussion on. But
it's a Wikipedia article that's like 10 to 15 to 20 pages long.
Yeah, and
right?
it's a Wikipedia
it's not
article,
a short.
So
it's not a short discussion. Critical theory is not a short discussion. Critical race theory is not a short discussion. Like, these are multi-hour things that you could probably break down into the details, and nobody's going to care by the time you're done. The short of it is,
yeah, but Yeah, speaking of, short of it. So, critical race, yeah, there is no short of it. The short of it on critical race theory is basically as it exists in the West today, because it doesn't properly exist anywhere else, so there is no other cultural context or societal context. White people are bad and must be made to pay for their original sin. And that's me throwing out a lot of the baby with the bathwater, but that would be what you would. That's something you could say to Trump.
You were complaining about me chopping off the toes.
I know.
I think
I know.
You got most of the vital organs.
I got like a leg or two with that one. I know. I did. But it's
there's no way to dive into that.
It's a real heavy conversation to really have, and there is no short way of saying it.
No.
Short of
that.
No,
there isn't.
Because it would be different if there was a secondary cultural context or tertiary cultural context to draw from, but it only exists in the West, and so it only has this one target. It's basically been stamped out anywhere else it comes to exist because it's dysgenic and dysfunctional. It's,
well, I mean, I think
it's akin to a mental cancer in a society.
I think a perfect. So we started off this whole entire thing, or the portion that I wanted to talk about was fracking, and we talked about the lie in the truth, right? The truth is that yes, there's quakes. The lie is that they matter, and that it's a justification for any action. The same thing's true for critical race theory. The truth is that it has something to do with diversity. The lie is that it is in any way a non-racist or enabling concept. It is an imprisonment of individuals into their racial groups, and nobody exists outside of their skin tone. It is a disgusting racist hypothesis that is promoted by people who are only interested in advancing themselves with no respect to what's actually going to have a positive impact on society. They've done zero analysis of the underlying issues. They present a simple, salve to the wound. It's entirely a feels
versus facts situation.
It is entirely a feels versus facts situation. I mean, you can't turn around and start saying that white people are the entire thing that is bad with society, and then simultaneously turn around and use Twitter, which is predominantly developed by white people. Right? Like, these things are, it is contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. We can either live in a multicultural society where we accept and develop with everybody the values of the product rather than the individual that went into making it, or we can focus on these minute details which you can't change about yourself and determine that anybody who doesn't fall into a certain series of archetypes is inherently evil. And it's twisted, it's wrong, and it's disgusting. I agree that Trump has no way, based on his character, he has no way of knowing, right? No way of diving into that, because that's just not how Trump is.
I mean,
he's not a details guy.
It's taken us, 10, 15 minutes here to even really
scratch the surface,
to kind of make it into something other than just white people are bad, they have to be punished.
Well, I think part of the problem is that it's fucking nonsense.
Also,
right?
Yes.
Like you're literally trying to translate 10 pages of nonsense into something that the average person can understand.
Oh yeah, garbage science that relies on garbage science. That's just. It's like everything wrong in science rolled up into a Gordian knot of garbage.
If the mainstream media was just half honest about critical race theory, it would turn off the entire population, and Biden wouldn't have used this, it's diversity trainings bullshit. No, that's not what it is. It's a disgusting ideology. It is entirely racist to its core. You're absolutely right. It has to do with concepts of original sin, except original sin is the fact that you were born into being, white or being whatever it is that you are. right? You can't escape it because, white people believe in time management. And that's just going to screw over all the black people, because black people, according to critical race theory, are incapable of time management. They're incapable of sitting there and planning for the future. It's ridiculous. It is trying to translate the absolute weirdest shit into normal people speech. I just don't know how you could do that in anything shorter than a couple hours. Like, we should probably post a link to a Wikipedia. Like, you should try to find a decent link to a decent explanation, not Encyclopedia Dramatica, probably not Wikipedia, because I'm pretty sure that like half that editing staff are folks that dive into this, but some sort of objective source that explains it.
But dive into share the gospel,
the joy,
as you will. I would say gospel is a more appropriate term considering what we're talking about here. I mean, you can't lie. They're proselytizing.
They absolutely are. I mean, you see, they have their holy text. They have their rituals and their chants.
Oh, they cast even just their high priests and priestesses.
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's a new world non-theistic religion. I am absolutely stunned by it. But, him not sitting there and trying to come up, like, he should have turned around and had a 1-minute response, which I am sure that if you take the best and the brightest of the people that are press folks, they could have come up with something for him to talk to on that. And that's the thing is, I think the first debate with Trump, it came across like he was unprepared. And that was a shame. Because
it is. That also, though, that is a bit of his shtick.
Yeah.
For whatever.
Unfortunately.
For, good and ill.
The upside is that he comes across as authentic. The downside is that he comes across unprepared.
Yeah. That's entirely true.
And that's... I think there's a way they could have prepared him to talk about it for the debates. But going forward, it is a tremendous concern for me.
And with an entirely adversarial media, there's not really anyone trying to get out what critical theory and critical race theory are. I mean, to be honest, you would need something like a PBS special on breaking this down, or at least a half hour with Geraldo. But we don't get that anymore. We get a half hour on why critical race theory is great, without actually going into any of the tricky details of, well, to make this all work, we have to make these ghettos and we have to put these social programs in so that the people stay in the ghettos and don't leave them. But wait,
yep.
How does that generate anything? And then we get into this deep spiral of, super predators and basketball courts and all these other things. And it gets incredibly complicated and uncomfortable for all sorts of people.
Well, I mean, there's no way to make it comfortable. I mean, there's no way to make it... First off, race discussions as a whole are an incredibly uncomfortable topic. Because there's some truth.
But they've been made that way. I mean, there's so much discussion that needs to be had that's not hard to have. It's just that people are unwilling to be reasonable. There's a lot of people that are unwilling to, in my own experience, be charitable. If people could
agree with that. I would agree with that.
Just, take it on faith that someone's trying to come at you with a good faith argument, we could get so much farther. I made a change in my life, and, just as an intro to pretty much anyone, I'm trying to just go at it, hey, they're coming at me good faith. In real life, you've got a lot more senses, so you got a lot more you can read from. On the internet, you don't. So when you do this, when you come across somebody that's honestly a little autistic, they don't read right, they don't register right, so if you give somebody a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, you can talk out a misunderstanding, and you might be surprised at how many people are willing to talk it out if you approach them from a place of positivity, of I would like to understand you. Now, sometimes you're going to totally get shut down, and when that happens, you mock them mercilessly.
Yeah.
But absolutely go in with with your hands open, like, hey, I'm just here to have the conversation. And if you get shut down, well, like I said, mock them mercilessly because they're funny, because they're stupid.
Well, I think your concept of the principle of charity is a perfectly good and reasonable argument. Let's start talking about every single time Trump gets in front of a camera, are you going to condemn white supremacy? He's done it a dozen or more. He's done it dozens of times. Literally dozens of times.
I was going over this with somebody. It was a great way of explaining it to him because he didn't really get what was going on. He doesn't follow politics so much. He's just happy that sports are back in. And, well, kind of happy. It's like, man, I wish they wouldn't be doing all this really weird stuff with it because I just kind of want to watch the game. Go figure. But I was explaining it like, well, what's happening is they're asking him, well, yeah. I know, we understand you, at that time, you decried this as bad, but are you willing to say that right now? Well, sure,
right,
sure.
And that's...
Yeah, well, yeah, now I understand. You said sure. But are you willing to say, yes, absolutely, I do? Because we didn't hear you say, yes, absolutely, I do. We just had a sure. And, I mean, can we be sure with sure? Well, I guess that means, that depends on what the meaning of is.
And that's I think, the thing that you start digging into with this. Like, I think his response, the appropriate response to that question, should have been to not respond to it. Or to specifically highlight that he's already responded to that multiple times, right? No matter what you do, you're not going to win that point, right? You can't
honestly.
The only thing you can do by responding to it is loose. Like, that's all you can do, and that comes down to, like you said, the principle of charity. The basic human response is that you are not a white supremacist. Right, that is a basic thing that we should all assume of our fellow man, that they are not white supremacists, that they don't hate groups of people for no fucking reason other than to hate groups of people. It's irrational, and people are not inherently irrational. So to assume that the President of the United States is a secret white supremacist who gives them all kinds of secret dog whistles is bizarre, to say the least. So when you turn around and you're being asked to condemn white supremacy, what do? Well, a lot of people are going to say, "Well, I would just do it," right?
Well, Steve,
but he's already done it.
Here we need to ask:
he's already done it.
Have you stopped beating your wife, or are you still beating her?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because he's already done it, and what are you going to do? Right. So you turn around and you say, "Hey, are you going to condemn white supremacy?" Well, yeah, I've already done that. Well, it doesn't matter that you've already done that, right? Do you condemn it now? Well, what the fuck are you talking about? I just did it 6 months ago. Do you think
so? You're denying that you'll do it now. You're saying,
yes,
but 6 months ago, a lot can happen in 6 months. So, are you willing to do it now? Yeah,
and that's you want to talk about the principle of charity? The idea that somehow an individual has gone from denouncing white supremacy multiple times over the last 4 years to secretly having been inducted into the White Supremacy Club of America, right? Which is all of like 100 people strong, right? In like 6 months since the last time you condemned it in its entirety, you can't win that. That's not charity. And you're no longer arguing in good faith. You're no longer debating in good faith, and you're no longer challenging the politicians in good faith.
And I'll be completely honest in this here. I travel in all kinds of circles. I've got friends from the far left to the far right. And even in some of these circles that people might call white supremacist, they really kind of aren't. They've got a different set of goals. And a lot of those people are even a lot more reasonable than people would put them out to. But, you've got this weight of original sin and this albatross of a label that makes everything just so much uglier, and the lack of charity means you just kind of can't have the conversation.
Well, I mean, I can't even tell you. Like, I used to have socialist friends, right? There was a couple folks I used to socialize with on Twitter who were actual avowed socialists, and I was okay with that. But when, like, what was it with the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory? This guy turned around and he told me that he saw all of this crazy stuff, this crazy series of patterns, which was most definitely going to evolve into something, right? It didn't happen. The Mueller investigation concludes with nothing there. And you turn around, and I went to this guy, I'm like, so are you going to just admit
actually, let me just pause you for a quick half second on the Mueller investigation. When the feds want to convict you of something, they can. It's said that the feds can convict a ham sandwich. So, when Mueller goes through all this and spends all these millions to get this investigation done and can't,
there's nothing there.
There's less than nothing. I mean, this was a complete fabrication from the start at best. Just to clarify that. But please continue. I wanted to give some context on that because a lot of people don't appreciate what a federal investigation truly is.
And that's well, I
it's
think
not some Gomer Pyle fucking Mayberry little investigation. Oh, I only got the one bullet in my gun, but I'll leave it in my pocket kind of bullshit. It's like, these are the brightest minds in their field. And some of them don't even like the fucking guy. And they couldn't nail anything on him. So, I mean, come on,
that's, I think, when you start talking about the people who are arguing there was obstruction of justice. When Mueller comes out there and says, hey, yeah, we couldn't find evidence of this criminal actual thing, and then people are trying to argue, well, there might have been obstruction of justice because Trump was opposed to this investigation into this thing that was not real. Like, you're like, wait a minute, hold on. So he's obstructing an injustice, and that's obstruction of justice because it's justice to have an injustice done against you. And it's a complete mental mindfuck on these people.
Doublethink.
Right? But you start turning around.
Doublethink. You have to hold two opposing ideals in your head at the same time. And this is...
You literally have to hold that Trump is innocent and that simultaneously protesting his innocence is admission of guilt in some other capacity. It's bizarro land.
And it also requires throwing out basic tenets of common law and American law. There is no innocent until proven guilty in this scenario, and that is a huge breakdown of the system. And we cannot allow that.
That is what really concerns me. Well, you dive into it, going back to my socialist friend there, I turn around to him and say, so you're going to admit that you were wrong, right? You believe that there was this underlying pattern that you saw and blah, 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 and you have pattern detection and all this other shit. Are you going to admit that you're wrong? He goes, no. Now we'll just go back to conventional opposition. And you're like, all right, so what the fuck did you just admit to? That you did unconventional opposition? That instead of being, just disagreeing with the man on principles, that you just made shit up? And that's really what we're dealing with right now, is we have people who are willing to completely fabricate an illusory idea of what has occurred, and it really concerns me. It really concerns me. I'm a science guy through and through to my core. I don't have, as much as I may end up traveling in your circle right now for conservatives, as I've mentioned before, I voted Democrat in the past. They could get my vote if they just stop lying. Oh, like that's all I'd have to do.
I made the mistake of voting conservative once. I disavowed the party entirely after that because I learned my fucking lesson. I mean, before everything in the world started getting really weird, I'd have absolutely called myself like a borderline anarchist. But now I have to support people I don't even like, and it's like, well, here the fuck we are. At least I'm going to be honest about it and just go with it. Because, I'm not going to burn down the world I live in, because I kind of like living here. So, Oh, right? On that note, man, why not? You familiar with punk at all?
Punk what?
Rock.
Occasionally.
And society. Okay. You've heard of the Sex Pistols, right?
Oh yeah. He just endorsed. He went full MAGA and blah blah blah.
Yeah, Johnny Rotten. Go fucking figure. But I mean, really, it's a bit of a meme, but conservatism kind of is the new punk rock. It's not exactly conservatism in what it would be understood in the traditional sense, but I mean, the world changes, and there are things there are new things that need to be conserved.
I had a PSA to begin this for all of you lovely people watching. It is Halloween season, and Halloween movies are going to be abound, and some of those movies are going to be quote unquote about Salem. None of them are actually filmed in Salem. They were filmed in my hometown of Marblehead. Please get it straight, because Salem is a shithole. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, there
it's
you
filmed
go.
next door.
Also,
but the point that I was going back to here, right, with what you were saying there, which I can't actually remember what you were saying. Just give me a moment.
No, absolutely. We've gone over quite a lot here.
Yeah, we have. No, what you were saying is the gosh, I had a reason to like dive into this.
Well, you were talking to your socialist friend.
About the MAGA, you were going with the MAGA stuff and all of the other stuff.
Oh yeah, how Johnny Rotten's got.
My wife actually mentioned that Rob Schneider, who was just in a Adam Sandler Halloween movie, which was incredibly dumb, but sometimes you got to watch dumb shit because it's funny. He turned around, and Rob Schneider apparently switched over and did the same thing as the Sex Pistols guy. Johnny Rotten. Yeah, so all of a sudden Rob Schneider a couple of years ago switched from Democrat to Republican simply because he was in the same boat where he was saying, hey, this just doesn't represent America anymore.
And believe it or not, Norm Macdonald has been talking up a storm lately. He hasn't really come out in support of like Trump or anything like that, but he's come out in support of reason. And he's actually been doing that for a couple years now. I recommend everybody follow Norm Macdonald on Twitter. He's a very reasonable man, and there's not a lot of reasonable people.
Really hoping. I'm really hoping, man. I'm really hoping that reason prevails.
Yeah, and I mean, well, there are things that we can do when we live in a reasonable world that we can't do in an unreasonable one, aside from the fact that it's on fire. And, I'm going to say, honestly, that's a hell of a great place to leave it off. So,
sure.
We'll catch you all again, undoubtedly next week. Hopefully we'll be able to have Craig and Steve, maybe somebody else, who knows. I play this a little bit by ear. I've got a couple of guests lined up, but I don't know when because they are busy. So, we'll see how it all works out, and thanks for listening. Peace, people.